I will first of all just introduce myself, say who I am, where I come from. I've only been with the Health and Safety Executive in the offshore division for about five months. And before that, I was an academic. I worked at the University of Aberdeen and was co-director of the Industrial Psychology Research Centre. And we did research on human factors, human and organisational factors actually, and safety in a wide range of industries. And back last November, there was an opportunity at the Health and Safety Executive as a human factors specialist, and I thought, yeah, I would like to get out there and start doing the applied stuff. I would like to start applying a lot of the theory, a lot of the practice that I've come to understand over the years in my academic role, and that's what I did. But at the moment, I'm actually not practicing the human factors side. I'm actually in a regulatory role, so I'm learning what it is to be an offshore inspector. Offshore, carrying out inspections, going through training, learning about the legal side of things. So I'll be very interested to hear Mark's presentation this afternoon. So, why me? Why talk about safety culture and leadership and safety climate as well? Well, because that was my main research area. That's what I spent about 20 years researching. So what I'm going to do this morning is share with you some of the lessons that certainly I learned doing that work. But I'm going to start off by giving you a quote from my new employer, the Health and Safety Executive, or the Crown, as it officially employs me. And that is, to be truly effective, health and safety has to be an everyday process, supported by all as an integral part of workplace culture. And there are two critical elements to that: strong leadership and involving the workforce. Now, my research is mainly focused on that first item there, the strong leadership. I've done less work on the workforce involvement, but these seem to be the key elements that need to be focused on, and everything else comes from that. So what am I going to talk about? What am I going to cover? Well, I'm going to have some reflections on what is safety climate and what is safety culture. Many academics have been debating this for decades. And to be honest, they haven't come to a consensus yet. But they are getting there. I'm going to give you some definitions and give you an idea of where we stand on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of leadership and workforce involvement in creating that culture and climate. And in particular, I'm going to share with you some lessons we learned from another industry, an industry that would be, I think, categorized as high reliability, and which you will all be familiar with, and that is air traffic control. So we learned some interesting lessons by going into air traffic control organisations and see what they do to maintain safety and the safety of the travelling public. At the end of the day, we do all this research, we have all this debate and discussion, we think safety culture is important, we think climate's important and leadership, but where's the evidence? What's the evidence base? And it actually is out there, it's pretty strong. And there is evidence that they do make a difference to the health and safety performance of organisations. So I'm going to start with some quotes. Now, this Professor Dov Zohar was the first person to ever coin the term safety climate. And he started researching safety climate in 1980. So the concept has been around for a very long time. And he is considered the #1 individual. He is the leader in this area of safety climate and has spent decades doing the research and working out the theoretical side of it. And he defines it as the perceived priority or value of acting safely, as assessed and mutually verified by employees. And what they use as their cues to determine what sort of behaviour they're going to exhibit and to understand what the expectations are of them, they use their leaders' daily actions. And the important thing is about shared perceptions and assessments of what happens at the workplace. So people are interacting, they come to understand what behaviours or which behaviours are likely to be rewarded, to be reinforced, to be supported. And people are constantly going through that process So they will see whether a supervisor says, well done, if somebody takes a little bit extra time to do a job properly and safely, as compared to the supervisor who sort of, gee up now, get a move on, we've got a deadline to meet. People are constantly picking up on those cues. And what is important and what is interesting is that we are constantly finding ourselves in ambiguous situations. We're constantly finding ourselves in situations where we're not quite sure what is expected of us. There's always competing demands. We know that from our everyday life. We've always got tight deadlines to meet. It's very difficult to sometimes know where the priorities lie. So with these competing demands of, say, efficiency, getting things done quickly, versus thoroughness, getting things done well, people make these evaluations. And they also make the evaluation, the company says, yeah, safety is very, very important to them. But then what actually happens at the workplace, at the work site, might be completely different from the established policy. What is enacted is what matters and what people are paying attention to and identifying with. And Professor Zohar goes a little bit further into this whole concept of safety culture, and he distinguishes between an organisational level safety climate and a group level climate. So the organisational climate would be the climate that is set by an organisation like Wood Group, like BP, like Shell, whatever. The group level will be maybe perhaps an offshore installation, it might be a work team, but there are distinctions there. And the top managers are responsible for developing the policies and procedures for the organisation, and the middle managers and supervisors are responsible for executing them to make sure that they're done as intended. And the employees, again, they make these discriminations between the organisational level climate and the group level climate. And they'll also look at different subunits at the group level. They'll compare their own work team with another work team, or one installation with another installation. And they'll see what the degree of difference is. And they'll notice things like to what extent senior managers backs the middle manager or backs the supervisor, if they are pushing for safety rather than other organisational goals. So what qualifies me? I mean, I've talked about Dov Zohar, top man in the area of safety climate. How do I qualify as somebody who knows something about this? Well, throughout the 1990s, actually post-Piper Alpha, myself and Professor Rona Flynn carried out a series of studies in the offshore industry here in the UK, building on Lord Cullen's report into the Piper Alpha disaster, which identified a litany of human and organisational failures, and also building on work in Norway. The Norwegians were pretty much ahead of the game at that stage in terms of their research offshore. I did one project on risk perception and safety, so we were interested in finding out what the risk perceptions were of offshore workers, and did those risk perceptions, how they perceived the hazards and the control of those hazards, did that influence their behaviour? Well, actually it didn't. They actually had pretty accurate understanding of where the risks lay. They knew what measures were required to mitigate those risks. What seemed to be driving their behaviour was how they perceived their supervisor and their management's commitment to safety. And that came through way back in, it was 1994 that research project came to an end, and the Health and Safety Executive published the report. And then we moved on to sort of, test that finding yet again, to find more evidence. Is this correct? Have we got the right idea here? And then had another study looking at human and organisational factors in offshore safety, looking more specifically at the supervisor commitment to safety measure and the management commitment to safety. And then that moved on to it was an enormous project trying to benchmark the human and organisational factors that we had identified as being important for safety performance. And that involved looking not only at the climates on specific installations, but also the safety management practices that were behind those climates. So what was creating those climates? And time after time, throughout these studies, we found that management and supervisor commitment to safety was associated with better safety compliance, so people were more likely to follow the procedures and not take shortcuts and not take risks. if they felt their managers and supervisors were committed to safety. And we also found that a workforce involvement measure, a part of the questionnaire that looked at workforce involvement, was associated with better reporting behaviour. So the workforce were involved, they felt more confidence about reporting incidents and near misses. And from there we have a learning going on, and I'll come to that later. So those were the studies I did throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And they're all available as HSE reports if you're interested. And I will also say that the industry, as well as the HSE, the industry supported those projects, both financially and giving us access to their installations and their offshore workforce. And for that, we are very grateful. So, from the evidence I've just shown you in terms of the offshore industry, we had very strong evidence that management commitment, supervisor commitment, workforce involvement were important. But there are a whole host of other researchers out there doing work in exactly the same area but with different industries. And what happens over a number of years, you build up a body of evidence, and then they carry out what are called meta-analyses. So basically they get hold of all the data that they can and they put it into an enormous statistical program and run the analyses, and you say, well, how strong is this effect? Does it bear out, and to what extent does it bear out? And these meta-analyses have been done relatively recently. 2006 was one of them, and 2009 was another. But what they found, again, is that there are relationships between safety climate and safety compliance, and also between safety climate and accidents and injuries. So better safety climate, fewer accidents, fewer injuries. The important thing that some of these meta-analyses looked at as well was that you don't just get the sort of management commitment, supervisor commitment, and then the behaviour. There's something happens in between, and that's what is meant by this mediation. So what is mediating? What is allowing that to happen? Well, there's aspects such as how people are motivated, their knowledge, their skills. You know, the workforce needs to be equipped with all these factors in order to achieve that good safety performance. And the other thing that has been found, again, is that leadership style, leadership characteristics at supervisor, middle management, and senior management level show a positive relationship with safety climate. So we're starting to see a pattern emerging. Good leadership, positive safety climate, motivation, knowledge, and skills, say good safety performance. Compliant behaviours, fewer accidents and injuries. Because actually, if you start to look at a lot of the accidents, one of the final triggers in the chain has been non-compliance or violation of procedures. So that's safety climate. And for me, safety climate, I understand what it is. I can neatly package it. I think I can measure it. And I think I know how I can manage it, potentially. But now I'm going to turn to the how can I describe it? The woolly cloud. And that's this concept of safety culture. And again, this concept emerged from public inquiries into major disasters. Chernobyl, Piper Alpha, Herald of Free Enterprise. If you look at these public inquiries, if you look at what the learned judges say about these disasters, they all say, well, there was definitely a lack of safety culture. But what is meant by that? Well, the Advisory Committee for Safety on Nuclear Installations, and the nuclear industry was obviously really focused on this post-Chernobyl, was that the safety culture of an organisation is the product of individual and group competencies and patterns of behaviour that determine commitment to and the style and proficiency of an organisation's health and safety management. But what does that actually mean? How on earth do we unpackage that? How on earth do we find what is critical in that amorphous mass of words? And that was always my issue with safety culture, and it actually still is. So what does that actually mean? What does that mean in practice? I came across a paper written by a sociologist, actually, called Susan Silvey. And sociologists tend to reflect more on the theoretical side than the psychologist. I'm a psychologist. You go out you have some ideas, you go out, you try and measure something, you try and find out what the relationships are. But Susan Silby had a very interesting and well-written reflective piece about the nature of safety culture, which actually challenges a number of different academic disciplines. And she saw it, she looks at it in 3 different ways. She looks at it as a causal attitude. And in a way, this causal attitude, the way people see things and that causes them to behave in a particular way, resonates with our understanding of safety climate. So it's about senior management commitment to safety. It's about norms and rules for dealing with risk. It's about positive attitudes to safety. And a critical point there for me is the shared care and concern about hazards and their impact. Care and concern are the key words for me there. And another key aspect that comes up again and again in our definitions of safety culture and our understanding of it is being able to reflect on your safety practices, be able to learn. You monitor, you carry out detailed analyses of your accidents and incidents, and you learn those lessons and feed them back into the organisation at all levels so people can learn the lessons. And in fact, Nick Pidgeon, who is actually a psychologist, actually came up with these ideas way back in 1991. And he did a lot of influential work on this for the Royal Society, amongst others. But the other aspect of safety culture, which was brought up by James Reason, another psychologist, and this came out sort of in the late 90s, is that safety culture can actually be socially engineered. So it's made up of different components, but those different components, when they come together, is more than a sum of those parts. And what it depends upon is a reporting culture, first and foremost. So people have to be willing, they have to be unafraid to report what is happening at the workforce, at the workplace. Things they feel uncomfortable with, near misses, things that almost go wrong. And the only way people are going to be willing to report is if they feel they're going to be dealt with in a just and fair manner. So you need a just culture. Not a no blame culture, but a just culture, because this idea of no blame culture, I'm afraid, does not work for me, because if people are culpable, if people are responsible for doing something deliberately wrong, then they need to be dealt with appropriately. I'll skip over flexible culture because, in actual fact, that should maybe come at the end. But the point is, if you've got a reporting culture, a just culture, you're going to have a learning culture, because you're going to be able to learn the lessons. You're going to be able to learn from your near misses and avoid that accident happening next time around. And that all leads very much to an informed culture. So you have information, you have safety knowledge, you have the detail at your fingertips, and you can work with that. This idea of a flexible culture is slightly outside of that, because what it refers to is how the organisation is configured. So most organisations are configured in a hierarchical way, so you've got different levels of responsibility and accountability throughout. The idea is that usually there's a top-down approach in terms of determining the direction and procedures and so on of the organisation. But when things go pear-shaped, what we've learned, or what we know from these high reliability organisations like air traffic control or like aircraft carriers, there's a transformation. This actually happens in the military as well. What happens is that all the responsibility and all the decision making is devolved down to the front line, down to the experts on the front line who know what they're doing, who are on the spot, who are having to cope with the problem. And the organisation trusts these people in order to do the right thing at the right time, because they are the experts. So there's a lot of trust required in there in order to sort of, get into that configuration from a hierarchical organisation to an organisation where you're putting responsibility, you're putting your trust in your frontline people who've got the expertise to sort out the problem. And that refers to being flexible, being able to adjust and then readjust back into that hierarchy again once the crisis is over. And I have seen it written or suggested in the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, the nuclear disaster last year. One of the problems was that in Japan you have got this very hierarchical, deferential culture. So people always have to go to a more senior person to ask permission to do things. That is part of their culture. That is part of what is their being, their entity. And so when the disaster started to unfold, the frontline personnel were waiting for instructions from higher up the line about what to do. So they didn't have that flexibility. They didn't have that flexibility to get on and sort out the problem there and then because they were waiting for permission. But that was only one component of what obviously is a complex situation. But I have seen suggestions that that's possibly one of the contributing factors as to why this situation escalated out of control. So as I say, so to sort of sum up then, you could actually socially engineer these aspects of the culture, but that would give you more than the sum of the individual part. It grows, it has a life of its own once you put all the pieces together. And this is the one that I think I'm actually starting to feel is probably most accurate. That the culture is actually very indeterminate and it's constantly changing and emerging and developing. Particularly when we're dealing with high-risk, complex industries, like the oil and gas industry, like the nuclear industry. Sometimes the hazardous situations are very, very ill-structured. We don't really understand what is going on. And there's sometimes a paradox there because we see things, but yet we don't see things because we have an acceptance of what is going on, we have an acceptance of certain norms which may not be appropriate. So we might see things, but in a way our minds are set not to see them. People who are making decisions have got a lot of uncertainty, often due to the complexity, and quite often not enough knowledge to make the right sorts of decisions. People live in different worlds of risk. So on an offshore installation, your catering personnel will have different perceptions of risk from your drilling personnel, for example. I mean, we know that, we've seen that. We've seen that different groups have a different way of looking at risk. If you're going to accept these risks, you've got to have a process of negotiation. You know, that acceptance has to come about through a sharing of an understanding and where the responsibilities lie. And perhaps one of the most critical things is that there's always going to be politics, there's always going to be, you know, this fighting for power going on in the background. You cannot avoid politics and this need for power. And they can actually, you know, they can be critical determinants in achieving the safety culture goals, particularly when it comes to organisational learning. But I think for all the years I've tried to understand and measure culture, I think for me this probably actually nails it. It's very, very difficult to do.